All right, let's dive right into this fascinating explainer of how the early 90s went from the sludgy, existential dread of grunge to the sharp, sophisticated joy of big band swing. I mean, it's honestly one of the most abrupt and visually striking cultural pivots in modern music history. We're going to look at the exact moment an entire generation just decided to trade in their ripped flannel and cheap beer for sharp zoot suits and dry martinis, and exactly why that happened. To unpack this massive paradigm shift, here's our roadmap. We'll be hitting the reign of grunge, the 1994 cultural vacuum, enter the swing revival, dissonance versus the swing ratio, the ADA tech revolution, and finally, the nostalgia pendulum cycles. So, part one, the reign of grunge. To really get this shift, we first have to examine the reigning champion of the early 90s. We're talking about the raw, lo-fi, heavily distorted sounds of Seattle's alternative rock movement. Grunge wasn't just a genre, it was a total cultural hegemony. The lyrics tackled super heavy, taboo topics like alienation and depression. And rhythmically, this whole mood was paired with straight 4/4 tempos that usually hovered at a pretty dragging 90 to 120 beats per minute. It was this slouching, heavy sound that basically perfectly mirrored the slacker aesthetic of the bands themselves. Now, let's nerd out on the music theory behind that angst for a second. It's called modal subversion. Basically, grunge musicians relied heavily on this. Take a massive hit like Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit. It's in the key of F minor, where an A note should naturally occur, but the song actually modulates that to an A flat. When you combine that out-of-place note with power chords absolutely overloaded from heavy amplifier distortion, you create a really rich, chaotic, and inherently dissonant sound. It was powerful for sure, but eventually that relentless dissonance led to some serious listener fatigue. Which brings us to part two, the 1994 cultural vacuum. Let's see how this listener fatigue built into an inciting incident that totally destabilized the alternative rock universe. The defining pivot point happens in April 1994 with the tragic death of Kurt Cobain, who was, without a doubt, the crown prince of Generation X. That loss completely paralyzed the alternative music industry. By that summer's Lollapalooza festival, where Nirvana was originally supposed to headline, by the way, the exhaustion was just palpable. The Smashing Pumpkins took over the headlining slot, and audiences at stops like Mountain View, California, were reported to be literally lying down in the grass. They were completely worn out by the heat and the screeching vocals. They had hit a wall. The landmark sound of the era had basically become the low point of the night. So, part three, enter the swing revival. Because right when grunge began to collapse under its own heavy weight, something totally different was brewing. A high-energy revival of chill, groovy music was already waiting in underground California clubs. And nothing shows this transition better than the Sub Pop paradox. Sub Pop was the very same Seattle record label that launched grunge. Yet in 1994, they released Combustible Edison's debut album. It was a masterclass in hi-fi 1950s exotica and lounge music. The band performed in ice cream-colored tuxedos and, get this, they even put cocktail recipes on the back of their CD. It was the absolute aesthetic antithesis of the greasy slacker look. And we really can't ignore Hollywood's role here. Hollywood had been quietly planting the seeds for this movement, giving swing immense visual legitimacy. Films like Swing Kids framed vintage dancing as a literal political protest against conformity. Then you had Jim Carrey in The Mask, doing this surreal dance in a banana yellow zoot suit. Hollywood basically took vintage dancing and turned it into a vibrant, highly athletic rebellion against the deadly, self-serious nature of alternative rock. All right, part four, dissonance versus the swing ratio. Let's put the reigning champion and the challenger in the ring together and look at the music theory. Why couldn't people stop moving to this new sound? Well, while grunge dragged with a straight metronomic 1-to-1 ratio of equal eighth notes, the neo-swing revival altered the actual physics of the rhythm. The swing ratio literally stretches the first eighth note to be 2 or even 3 times longer than the second. It creates this propulsive triplet groove that demands what researchers call predictive synchrony. And what you should take away from that fancy term is that it's just the scientific way of describing that uncontrollable visceral impulse you get to jump up and dance. Just look at the sheer totality of this paradigm shift. Musically, we went from chaotic polyphony and distorted power chords rooted in fifths straight over to homophonic, horn-heavy arrangements focused on third and seventh jazz chords that totally sweetened the sound. We completely rewrote the rulebook, pivoting from brooding intensity to this classy, vibrant celebration of life. Moving on to part 5, the ADAT tech revolution. Because here is the secret. This crisp, massive big band sound wouldn't have even been commercially viable for indie bands without a massive tech breakthrough. Get this, before 1991, if you wanted to capture 24 tracks of high-fidelity audio, you needed a professional studio, and it cost upwards of $150,000. But then, a company called Alesis debuted the ADAT digital recorder. It plummeted that price tag down to roughly $4,000 a unit, a total game changer. Grunge bands, they loved the sound of analog tape, right? It gave them that tape hiss and that dirty aesthetic they craved. But swing music? It requires absolute transparency to capture all the nuances of a huge brass ensemble. Because these new digital ADAT units ran on standard SVHS videotapes and could be synchronized together, semi-pro studios could suddenly record up to 128 synced tracks. It completely democratized audio recording and delivered the pristine transparency required for authentic big band music. Finally, part 6, the nostalgia pendulum cycles. Let's zoom out and look at the overarching sociological mechanics of all this. How did a 1940s aesthetic manage to temporarily conquer the 1990s? Sociologists call this the nostalgia pendulum. The theory basically posits that pop culture trends resurface in roughly 30-year loops. Generation X creators were so tired of their own era's unwashed uniformity that they looked back exactly 30 to 40 years. They reclaimed the upbeat, classic jazz and swing that an older generation had completely abandoned and labeled as uncool. And the sheer irony of this cultural recycling is just stunning. In the 1940s, marginalized youth wore oversized zoot suits as a direct rebellion against wartime material austerity. They used excess fabric as a protest. Fast forward to the 90s, and swing kids used the exact same suits to rebel against the slovenly, anti-materialistic uniformity of the alternative rock scene. The very same article of clothing served as a defiant punk rock statement across two entirely different eras. It just goes to show you that authenticity in fashion and music is purely cyclical. So, since pop culture is this ever-evolving realm driven by our response to oversaturation, it leaves us with a really fascinating question to ponder. Right now, as that 30-year nostalgia pendulum inevitably swings back again, what completely uncool sound from the past is secretly waiting in the underground clubs just getting ready to become tomorrow's biggest cultural shift? Keep your ears open.